It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Pete Peterson. Pete Peterson is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University and a leading national speaker and writer on issues related to civic participation and the use of technology to make government more responsive and transparent. He was the first executive director of the bipartisan organization Common Sense California, which in 2010 joined with the Davenport Institute at the School of Public Policy to become the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and Civic Leadership. Peterson has co-created and currently co-facilitates the training seminar, Public Engagement, the Vital Leadership Skill in Difficult Times, and he also co-created and co-facilitates the seminar, Government 2.0, What Public Officials Need to Know, which explores the ways in which technology is changing local government processes. In 2017, the School of Public Policy launched a new initiative titled The American Project on the Future of Conservatism, which is co-directed by Dean Peterson. The project is a unique effort to gather scholars and activists from a variety of points on the conservative spectrum to deliberate over, write about, and discuss the future of the conservative movement. Peterson writes widely on public engagement for a variety of major news sources, including the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and San Francisco Chronicle, as well as numerous blogs. He is a regular guest on the Politics Roundtable with host Larry Mantle on KPCC Radio. Pete has been a public affairs fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he serves on the leadership councils of the Public Policy Institute of California and California Forward, and on the boards of the Homeland Security Advisory Council and the Da Vinci Charter Schools. Peterson was a Republican candidate for California's Secretary of State in 2014, and we are very happy to welcome him to the Reagan Ranch Center tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dean Peterson.
Thank you. So this is my clicker here. Okay. Well, good evening. Great to be with you. I am Pete Peterson. That is my real name. It's a Norwegian thing, and the first Pete Peterson, as I was explaining to my table, came from Norway in 1854 and landed in the small fishing village of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and that's why I'm a devout Packer fan. Do we have any Packer fans in the room? There we go. Say it loud and proud. So very honored to be here at YAF and the Reagan Ranch Center. The relationship between the School of Public Policy and YAF has been longstanding. We love to recruit their undergraduate students to our graduate policy school. I've brought my board here to go both here and to the ranch, a number of friends, both of the policy school and YAF and the Reagan Ranch Center. And so it's great to be with you all. I do a lot of speaking on college campuses and not so much with high schoolers, but I'm gonna call an audible here and ask a question that I always begin my presentations with when I speak on college campuses, especially with students who happen to be probably a little more center-right. And so I'm curious as to what your feedback is given your experiences in high school. So question number one that I always ask, by show of hands, how many students here have felt like you've been either dismissed or ridiculed by one of your teachers because you took a conservative or center-right perspective in a classroom discussion? Show of hands. Okay, let the record show that's at least half. Second question, how many feel that you have been downgraded on a test or written assignment because you took a conservative or center-right perspective on a particular test question or essay assignment? Show of hands. At least a third. Friends, these are hard times. And these are about the same percentage responses that I see when I speak on college campuses. Let me say at the top that if you can ever find your way to Malibu, California, when you graduate not only from high school but from undergrad, The coffee is on me in Malibu, California, which, if you didn't know, is about an hour and a half south of here. One of the other common ties between our institution at Pepperdine and YAF, and it sounds like for some of you, is the commemoration of 9/11. It was YAF students at Pepperdine in the early 2000s that organized what has become really one of the largest flag demonstration. We call it the Waves of Flags each year at Pepperdine, in which we put up over 3,000 flags, each standing about yay high, each one representing the nation from which we lost someone on that fateful day across the front lawn. If you Google Waves of Flags, if you have not seen that, the video and the pictures, this again is something that we can attribute to our relationship. I would also say, and didn't plan on going here, but hearing that some of the students are involved in 9/11, I'm so glad that you're continuing to do this. I was in New York on 9/11. We lost a family friend and someone I knew from church, one Jerry Paskins and another John Crotty. So two of the flags, for those of you who are planting flags on 9/11, please remember those names. I was in Central Park after being evacuated from the building I was working in at 38th Street and 8th Avenue. And as I stood in the middle of Central Park at around 2 o'clock that afternoon, I stared down at the pillar of smoke coming out of what used to be the Twin Towers. And I knew then, in ways that are difficult to describe, that the world was changing. And not only was the world changing, but I was changing. I had worked in marketing and advertising for the better part of 15 years when 9/11 happened. But it was that day that made me think that I need to be doing something different with my life. It's not as if I didn't enjoy my job. It's not as if I didn't enjoy the work I was doing. But when 9/11 happened, it really spoke to me in a way that, as a person of faith, and I love the way that my friend Andrew put it, I began to search and understand the meaning of calling on my life. What that sent me to was an understanding that I had a calling to politics and policy. If you had asked me on 9/11 in Central Park what Pepperdine was, much less where it was, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. As a kid growing up in Jersey, there was no way I had any idea what Pepperdine was. But through a search and an exploration of calling in my own life, it led me to a place where my life was changed, which was the School of Public Policy, where I came to about 17 years ago. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, and this talk has nothing to do with calling, by the way, if you take nothing else from this talk, I would only ask that you take this time in your life very seriously. Not in a dour sense, not in a way that everything needs to be serious or sad, but that you take this time seriously to explore your gifts, to do these things both in community with friends and family, and to make very intentional decisions as you move toward the next step. I know how much pressure some of you feel, especially if we have any high school seniors in this room. But I wouldn't doubt that that pressure bleeds all the way down to some of your freshmen, as some of you are being pushed and prodded into a particular college or university. This is not about feeling that kind of pressure. I would just offer, and I'm doing this on live stream, and some of your parents are going to be very unhappy with me, and I say this as dean of a graduate policy school, that it may be possible that some of you aren't actually called to college or university. Maybe some of you are. Maybe you're called to a college or university that's not on your list. But because of who you are and what's being offered, you should really think long and hard about these next steps. So this is not going to be so much a keynote. I hate to disappoint my host here, Mariana, as much as it is going to be an encouragement and a preparation. As Andrew said, and it was great to hear Z give some of these personal experiences. As I look at the agenda for tomorrow, you are going to encounter some amazing stories. People who have lived under communism and socialism. And with that, one of the natural reactions that some of you are going to have, and I could even sense myself doing it as I was hearing Z's stories, is that it becomes very easy to disconnect yourself from those stories, right? To say, wow, communism sucks. I'm glad I didn't live in that time. You know, if I did, maybe I would have acted different. Maybe I would have resisted. Maybe I would have protested. Maybe I would have done something else. And in so doing, I just want to encourage you to live into the stories in which you are hearing. To understand them not as historical events, but as life stories of human beings just like you interacting within a system far different from the one that you live in. So I've titled this talk, Thinking Historically in Challenging Times. Now, thinking historically is a phrase that we use at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine. The Graduate Policy School, we are about preparing leaders in politics and policy across the country and around the world. We use the phrase thinking historically as a way of describing our unique curriculum that combines elements of policy analysis and quantitative research with history and political philosophy. That combination between both sides, kind of the left brain and right brain of politics, is a way of getting people to think differently about the problems and policy challenges that we face, whether it's here in Santa Barbara, in the nation's capital, or around the world. So thinking historically, to be clear, is not knowing history. It's not being a history major. It's a way of looking at the world around you and to understand it didn't just get here by itself. There's a great Southern saying that says, I think it's a Texan saying, that if you see a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there by itself. In the same way, the events of today, whether it's COVID, whether it's cancel culture, whether it's what's going on in China or Eastern Europe, whether it's what's happening here in California, all of these things have antecedents. All of these things have a history that goes before it. And thinking historically as you approach these issues is an important way to understand and to think about not only how things got to this place, but very possibly where things might be going. Now, what's so important about this perspective is that for many of you in your generation, the study and analysis of socialism is about an inch deep. As we look at some of the data that I've uncovered about your generation, known variously as Gen Z, some of these data points won't surprise you, certainly given the show of hands that I saw earlier, but it's worth just putting out there a few of these data points. The first from Gallup in 2018, over half of 18 to 29-year-olds view socialism positively. Just last year, the Victims of Communism organization, a great group that is launched in Washington, D.C., did a survey of Gen Z to find that 74% do not see Marxism as a, quote, totalitarian state that suppresses the freedom of its citizens. And finally, this bullet point from Vice magazine doing a survey of Gen Z last year found that 57% of Gen Z see socialism as a solution, quote, to combat violence against marginalized peoples. Now, as we've just heard from Z, what socialism actually means is actually none of these things. But even the writers for Vice magazine in this piece understand that the general understanding by many in your generation of what socialism actually was and what socialism actually is wildly divergent from both its history and reality. This quotation I pulled from that same article: socialism may boil down to a mood or a structure of feeling rather than a politics to adopt wholesale for members of Gen Z. Though they might hold inconsistent positions, as many of us do, Zoomers, Gen Z, grasp the core essence of socialism and are finding that it provides them with an intuitive way of making sense of the world. Viewed in this light, a 15-year-old who is skeptical of Marx and Sanders but identifies with the socialist label isn't necessarily evidence of the ideology's dilution. Instead, she might be proof that socialism has become synonymous with a love of justice and a desire for positive social change. Now, again, it's anybody have friends, by the way, who have this kind of perspective on socialism, right? That somehow just in the name socialism, it's social. Social is good. Capitalism is money. Money is greed. Greed is bad. It's a very simple tautology, moves ahead very simply, but socialism, again, as you all understand and will gain new insights into tomorrow, is really something wholly other. And it requires no historical awareness to hold positions like this. So as you enter into the day tomorrow and throughout the panels, thinking historically is a way of not only moving into the stories of the people that you will hear, but finding ways to apply that history in ways that are not only relevant to what happened, but may be relevant to what is and what is coming. Another way of describing thinking historically was done by Neil Ferguson, the Stanford and Harvard historian, works at the Hoover Institution. We've had Neil speak for the School of Public Policy on a couple of occasions. And again, he uses the term applied history as a way of understanding how we connect history, not simply as a set of events that happened 40 or 50 years ago, but why they're relevant to today and what it might tell us about the future. This is how Neil describes applied history. Applied history is the explicit attempt to illuminate current challenges and choices by analyzing historical precedents and analogues. Mainstream historians begin with a past event or an era and attempt to provide an account of what happened and why. Applied historians begin with a current choice or predicament, stimulate imagination, find clues about what is likely to happen, suggest possible policy interventions, and assess possible consequences. Now, Ferguson's recent book is called Doom, which is a great book. And one of the things that he cites there is many of the ways in which the both American government and other national governments are responding to the COVID crisis betray a certain ignorance of history and how other societies have dealt with pandemics over the past centuries. What Ferguson lays out, that even in something that seems very pressing and modern as COVID-19, that by studying history and knowing how other governments and societies have responded in a way that maintained a sense of freedom while still attacking a dreaded disease, those, what he calls analogues and precedents, really should have been better applied by today's public leaders. Now, there are a couple challenges to thinking historically. One I've just laid out there is that when you hear the stories that you're going to hear tomorrow and the ones that you just heard from Z here, it's going to feel very easy to want to separate yourself, to disconnect yourself from those stories, to say that and appreciate possibly that you didn't live in that time, but to say that that story really has nothing to do with me. And in that, there are really two types of challenges, what I call internal and environmental challenges to thinking historically. The first two are civic virtues. One is humility and the other is prudence. To think historically is to be humble in the face of events that you didn't live in, and to understand that even if you believe you would have acted differently in light of these challenges, to understand that people were really doing the best they could because they were human beings just like you. Yes, they grew up in very different times and possibly very different cultures. But understanding and looking back at history and disconnecting yourself from that requires that you overcome that feeling through a sense and the virtue of humility. The second is prudence. Prudence is the ability to apply right concepts with right circumstances. And prudence is the ability to take what we can learn from the past and rightly apply it to what's happening today and what might happen in the future. Not every example of what happened as governments responded to the pandemics of the last few centuries is applicable today. But by being prudential and wise in analyzing what we can gain out of the past, you can rightly apply these concepts and lessons to what is happening today and possibly analyze and predict the direction in which we're heading. Now, there is a third civic virtue that I'll get to at the end, but suffice it to say at this point, humility and prudence are essential to thinking historically. These are the internal challenges. Now, environmentally, the challenges are many of you are in schools and programs that think anything that happened prior to 3 years ago was led by generally antiquated human beings who really didn't understand the great virtues of social justice or environmental justice or some word and justice without actually just saying justice. And in that, being taught history in such a way that discounts the past and the roles and actions that people took is again a sign of hubris. To say that you would have acted differently than Thomas Jefferson would, to say that you can discount our founders, that you could discount Ronald Reagan because of what you now know, is a sign of pride and hubris. It is much better to do, as the historian M.I. Finley wrote, it is easy to score points over a dead society, more difficult and more rewarding to examine what they were trying to do. Now, when we think about the concept of thinking historically, and again, this is the way that we look at the past, not only to better understand our present, but possibly to see what is coming down the road. We hosted a conference on our Malibu campus just 2 weeks ago with the author Rod Dreher about his best-selling book, Live Not by Lies. Live Not by Lies is really a work of thinking historically, a way of analyzing the past, not only to understand what happened, but to get a different sense of what's happening today and what might be coming in the future. The core concept and core argument that Dreher makes in this book is that while the past in living in communist totalitarianism had a sense of what might be called a hard totalitarianism, government enforced in all the ways that Z has described this evening in Lithuania, and you will hear tomorrow, there is yet another type of totalitarianism that he is seeing beginning to occur here in the United States that he describes as soft totalitarianism. Now, I'll describe this in more detail in a second, but suffice it to say at this point, a way of understanding soft totalitarianism is through examining and better understanding the roots of cancel culture. These are not necessarily government-informed social norms that you're experiencing. These are cultural norms that it's sometimes very difficult to find where those norms are created from and where they're being forced upon you. But I think everyone here has known that if you've been in certain experiences in groups or classes, you have known that there have been times when you've had to squelch what you wanted to say for fear that you will lose friends or be dismissed by one of your teachers or faculty members. Now, again, this isn't necessarily government involvement. It is not of the hard totalitarianism that we have seen, but it's not to say that it can be completely dismissed as a way of understanding our current democratic culture. Now, the title of the book, Live Not by Lies, is derived from a letter written by the Soviet dissident and Christian Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn wrote a letter to his countrymen and women in 1974. Solzhenitsyn had been a dissident who had suffered torture and imprisonment in the Soviet Union for his beliefs and critiques of the state. And in 1974, on the day that he was exiled from the Soviet Union, he wrote this letter to his fellow Soviet citizens. I wanted to quote a couple pieces from it. The letter is short. It's only a couple pages. And for those of you who haven't read it, I strongly recommend that you do so. But I wanted to begin with this one quotation. "We are approaching the brink. Already a universal spiritual demise is upon us. A physical one is about to flare up and engulf us and our children. While we continue to smile sheepishly and babble, but what can we do to stop it? We haven't the strength." Now, Solzhenitsyn understood that there was a unique quality in totalitarianism, which culturally took people and isolated them if they deviated from the cultural norms instituted by the government. And so it was very easy to think as an individual that maybe I'm the only person that thinks this way. And I know one thing, if I step out of line, there are going to be penalties. Now, in the Soviet Union, those penalties were severe. We are not seeing those kinds of penalties here, just to be clear. But at the same time, what Solzhenitsyn was saying is that it is understandable that you feel oppressed. But what he was going to call his fellow citizens to is to take baby steps of resistance. Because what Solzhenitsyn understood about the Soviet Union is that it was based on a series of lies. Lies that because of the force of government, everybody was forced to kind of go along, and as he said in that earlier quotation, kind of sheepishly babble, I guess that's right. Knowing all the time that what you were being told about the current state of the world that you were living in, told to love it, told that this was the future, told that you were the vanguard of humanity. You knew in your heart it was a lie, as Solzhenitsyn did. This is what he wrote. "Communism requires, quote, a submission to daily participation in deceit, and this suffices as our fealty or loyalty. And therein we find, neglected by us, the simplest, most accessible key to our liberation." Liberation, friends, to people who are living under Soviet totalitarianism. Solzhenitsyn was going to say, here is your key to liberation. A personal non-participation in lies. Now, what he lays out later in the letter are a series of bullet points, around 7 or 8 of them, different ways, and we've heard one from Z already. We were not going to participate in the May Day celebration. That was not participating in lies. But there were a number of different ways to do that. And it was one way to internalize in a very personal way that this was a step that you could take. Do you see where this is going? Do you see where this is going? Now, if you're thinking historically, and I have just proposed as an example, that it may be the case that while hard totalitarianism is of a different kind and level than soft totalitarianism, it may be the case that you all, including me, are living under some degree of soft totalitarianism, and that it is based on living with lies. What might that mean for you? Are there lies that you're having to live with? Lies that are taught in school, lies that are given to you by the culture around you. No, they're not government enforced. You're not going to go to a gulag. But people will say things around you and you say, that's not right. But I'm not going to say anything about it. This is what Solzhenitsyn was saying to people who had a lot more to lose. But it was the one step each individual could take. So back to Dreyer. So what Dreyer is saying, and the genesis, the impetus for this book, is he started meeting with immigrants from the former Soviet republics living under communism. And as they were watching what was going on in the United States, they were beginning to see facts and events that were resonating. They were, to borrow a phrase, triggering in them thoughts that they had not experienced since they lived under the hard totalitarianism. To borrow another quotation from the book, what makes the emerging situation in the West similar to what they faced? After all, every society has rules and taboos and mechanisms to enforce them. What unnerves those who lived under Soviet communism is this similarity. Elites and elite institutions, and let's be clear, we are talking about schools, Hollywood, and culture makers, are abandoning old-fashioned liberalism based on defending the rights of the individual and replacing it with a progressive creed that regards justice in terms of groups. It encourages people to identify with groups, ethnic, sexual, and otherwise, and to think of good and evil as a matter of power dynamics within those groups. So what Dreyer was beginning to see, and again, hearing this directly from people like the ones that you'll hear from tomorrow, is that things were happening in the culture, especially around, again, what could be called variously cancel culture, that were triggering them in the same kind of thoughts that they had living under hard totalitarianism. Now, the reason I asked the question that I did at the beginning, the two questions, was that in a certain sense, if you are being critiqued, if you don't feel free to speak your mind, to do so in a civil way, to do so grounded in things that you've read or understood, not to pop off like a jerk, but if you have a case to make that is still being critiqued and dismissed by teachers, you have a decision to make. That decision is, well, I'll just go along and write whatever the teacher says because I need to get an A, because I need to go to Harvard. Let me just say, you do not need to go to Harvard. I am not kidding. I am not kidding. Recent survey by the Harvard Crimson newspaper in June of this year found that in a survey of Harvard faculty, less than 3% described themselves as conservative or very conservative. 3%. You think you're getting a lot of freedom of speech in Cambridge, Massachusetts? Now, again, you got to work these things out with your parents. But again, as we go back to this subject of calling and what you're thinking about your own future, do so with your eyes wide open. I'm not saying there aren't great conservatives on that campus, but they're having to deal with battles there that frankly they shouldn't have to deal with. Now, somebody else who we had speak at this conference that I mentioned around Dreyer's book, Live by Lies, is Habi Zhang. Habi is a graduate of the School of Public Policy. I think it's fair to say, she would say, her life was changed by the experience. She grew up in China and has become increasingly vocal about not only her experiences growing up in China in the 90s and early 2000s, but also, again, thinking historically, the patterns of behavior and culture she is beginning to see here in the United States. I love the title of this piece that she wrote in June for the website, The American Mind, The People's Republic of Campus. She writes, I have yet to see another contemporary case of the union of school and ideology in America that is more revealing than the Evergreen Equity Council. In 2017, the Evergreen State College gained notoriety for the exile of former Professor Brett Weinstein. The origins of Weinstein's exile started in 2015 when the school initiated the Evergreen Equity Council, a set of yet-to-be-tested conjectures drafted by a group of so-called anti-racist educators was presented as a list of consecrated tenets in one of the council meetings. And she goes on to describe that many of these anti-racist sessions that she has learned about happening on college campuses and even some high school campuses remind her of some of the Maoist training sessions that she endured as a student growing up in high school in China. Now, again, you can agree or disagree with the proposal that there is something to learn historically from the lessons that you'll hear tomorrow and the lessons that Hobby is discussing here from her own experiences. But let's at least do so with our eyes wide open. This is the importance of thinking historically. Let me conclude with this slide. And I wanted to get to that third and final civic virtue. This is the concluding portion of Solzhenitsyn's letter, again titled Live Not by Lies. Yes, at first it will not be fair. Solzhenitsyn, to step out, understands that even the step of not living by lies, even taking these very modest steps not to give into and agree with and internalize the lies that they knew they were experiencing, is going to require sacrifice. Yes, at first it will not be fair. Someone will have to temporarily lose his job. For the young who seek to live by truth, this will at first severely complicate life. For their tests and quizzes, too, are stuffed with lies. Tests and quizzes, too, are stuffed with lies. So choices will have to be made. But there is no loophole left for anyone who seeks to be honest. Not even for a day can he avoid even a single one of the listed choices. And this refers to the different ways that Solzhenitsyn lists that his countrymen could live not by lies. Can he avoid even a single one of the listed choices to be made in favor of either truth or lies? So tomorrow you're going to hear some hard stories. I've seen George's presentation before. The pictures that you are going to see are going to be extremely disturbing. Trigger warning. But they were not created on some Hollywood soundstage. These were not created in some sort of design program. This is a reality of what happened, what people just like us, people just like you, human beings, individuals, had to endure. But I really do hope and pray that you don't stop there. Please do this just for tomorrow. Let the lessons come to you and enter into those stories. Just be in those stories. Don't be where you're going back to. Don't be with the test you have to return. Don't be with that thinking about, wow, that guy's kind of cute. Don't be in those places. Be in the stories. And at the end of the day, don't think about this as a history that's past. At least entertain the thought that there are those who've gone before us that had to be extremely courageous to live by the truth. It's fair if you don't want to get into this, boy, that soft totalitarian stuff that's pretty hardcore. I'm not sure if I'm ready to go there. Okay, don't. But just deal with this subject. Are there lies that you're dealing with? Now, Solzhenitsyn said, choices will have to be made. It may not be the right choice to respond to your teacher who says something that is an out and out lie. It might not be the right case to respond to a classmate or even a parent or friend who says something that is an out and out lie. But this much I believe. I believe we're entering a time where the watchword for this generation, the watchword for your generation, will be courage. And it may not be storming some battlefield. It may just be standing up for the truth. And so my prayer for you is that in your own lives, in your exploring and understanding of history and why it's relevant to today and maybe to our future, and to consider your own calling upon your own life, that you would live by the truth. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean Peterson. We have time for a few questions. Students, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone, and please give us your name and school.
Hello, I'm Avi Williams from San Ynez High School. I recently applied to Pepperdine. Is there a good, conservative Christian presence on the campus?
Yes, there is. I'm obviously at the graduate school, but I have a lot of friends at Seaver College, which is the undergraduate program. I think it's fair to say that the policy school is the organization or institution on campus that focuses most on the principles that Ronald Reagan held dear. But there definitely is a significant and serious Christian commitment there. And there are places, both in faculty and student organizations, where you can feel accepted and free to explore and deepen your conservative thoughts and intellect. And if you make it to Pepperdine, come up here and I'll give you a card. We're also on the Malibu campus and would love to get coffee.
My name is Sarah. I'm from Buchanan High School, and my English teacher is actually pretty okay with writing about political stuff. So is the Solzhenitsyn letter and the book by Dreyer that has the same title, are those good sources as arguments against communism?
So I actually mentioned this in one of the panels. I moderated one of the panels at the conference. You all are so fortunate. I know that it took some sacrifices to be here. It also took some sacrifices for others to get you here, just to be clear about that. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of tomorrow, you're going to know much more about the lived experience, to borrow a phrase, of those who lived under communism than 95% of people your age. I say that to say that the book lived not by lies, if it were only taken as a history book, because there are so many interviews of people. I'll just tell one story that's in the book. At one point, Dreyer is interviewing, and he's actually traveling through Eastern Europe. He meets someone who was a communist state official who didn't participate directly, but heard the story of what had happened with a regular practice of the state, which was to kill Christians. And at one point, this former communist official tells the story that oftentimes in this one field in the forest outside of a village, the state would trot out, usually in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 priests, heavily Catholic area. And they would line them up directly like this, if you can imagine them facing you, and directly like this. And they would have them face the person in front of them. And the communist official, the soldier, would step up and say, "Do you renounce Christ?" And the priest would say no. And he would shoot him in the head. And they lined him up like that because his brains would splatter against the next person. And then he would walk up to the second person and say, "Do you renounce Christ?" And every single priest didn't, knowing what was coming. Now, you can say that's an extreme story, but another part that Z did not mention is what communism means for people of faith, what socialism and secularization means eventually for people of faith. And that is a story that I think one of many that is in the book, that just knowing the history is important. And it's like I said, as we think historically, you can understand the history, and as Dreyer says, yeah, but there's actually some things you need to be worried about now. You can disagree with that. And I think well-meaning people can disagree and just say, hey, I think that's too extreme. But I think the book is well worth picking up because it's a very easy read, and it will give you just another level of understanding as to what people have endured under communism. So I think it's a great history book in and of itself. And to the degree you take it as an applied history book, that's up to you.
For your English teacher, you could recommend The One Day in Life of Ivan Denisovich. Basically, it's about the Gulag, and it's a novel. So maybe your English teacher could add that to the curriculum.
You have time for another question? Anyone? I actually have one that I'd love to close us out with. So I've heard a few speakers in the past talk about, the challenges of fighting, leftism and liberal bias, especially in higher education. And I've heard some differing perspectives on how students should handle that. Some say that you should just go along to get the degree and then get out there and change the world. There's a little aspect of you have to get where you're going in order to have real influence, to actually change the world, the country for the better, and to introduce conservative ideas. And then there are other people who think that you should fight for conservatism all the way and make your voice heard. Don't just say what the teacher wants to hear to get the grade. What would be your response to that, and how would you encourage students to deal with this issue?
Well, the first thing I would do is to understand how much work is required, especially when you're thinking about the possibility of going to college or university. This gentleman here who may be going to Pepperdine, you really have to be intentional about that decision. And if it starts and stops with how good the football team is, that's a bad place to start. If it starts and stops with how beautiful the campus is, or I hear they have a nice art program, again, not enough. For those of you who are interested in careers in policy and politics, for those of you who want to be able to express yourself as a conservative, it's worth doing a deeper dive to say, are there departments, are there professors, are there conservative organizations on campus or faith-based organizations, if you're a person of faith, that you can find your way into? And that will take actually getting on the ground to speak with current students, to find current faculty members. If there's a YAF chapter on that campus, you should be asking those questions first. And if you have a conversation with a student that's running the YAF chapter at USC, and that person says, you want to be an economics major? This is not the school for you. Then and I'm not saying I'm just saying that as a hypothetical. You really need to make decisions for yourself. But do it with your eyes open and ask the kind of questions that this gentleman is asking in the back, because it's a lot more than what you see on the website. Your day-to-day is going to look like what your classroom experiences are going to be and your classmates and the general campus environment. And again, know yourself. There are people that look at Harvard, understand that 97% of their faculty are left or far left, and say, I'm up for that challenge. They can bring it. And besides, I'm going to go into the natural sciences anyway, and so actually the natural sciences is probably the least biased area of academia. Nobody really cares if you're a Marxist physicist, because kind of physics is physics, right? And so thinking about what you're willing to deal with, but also really getting an understanding of what that campus environment is at a deeper level than I think most students do. Thanks.
One more round of applause, please. This brings us to the conclusion of tonight's opening dinner banquet. We have a full schedule tomorrow, so we want to make sure that our students are well rested. But before we head on over to the hotels, we're actually going to head just across the hall to watch a short film called Still Point in a Turning World. Young America's Foundation presents this award-winning film by director Stephen K. Bannon, Still Point in a Turning World, the definitive examination of Ronald Reagan's beloved ranch and its personification of his philosophy and values. Of course, some of you got to visit the ranch today, others have visited in the past, and some have yet to make it to the Reagan Ranch. This is a really awesome introduction to Young America's Foundation, our connection to President Reagan, and why the ranch is such a special place. Ronald Reagan's Rancho del Cielo, the ranch in the sky, was not just a respite from the chaos that his presidency encountered, but also a living embodiment of the values he held dear, where hard work and self-reliance showed themselves in the principles he championed for all Americans: freedom, prosperity, and victory. While this film is only about 20 minutes long, it never fails to make me well up and swell with patriotism. And I'm sure that it will have the same effect upon you. So with that, students, if you wouldn't mind, please standing up and heading right across the hall to the theater. Thank you.